Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Haptic Feedback, a Shockoe podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. Folks, thanks for joining us on another episode of the show. Today is continuing a three-part conversation on product strategy. So if you missed the first episode, put a pause on this. Go find that first episode and get all caught up on where we left off in the conversation. This is part 2 of that three-part conversation. So before we get deeper into what we're going to be discussing today and how it fits into the larger conversation, I want to make sure that you have access to that previous episode and all of Shockoe's content and more information about how we fit into the industry. So make sure that you're heading to our website, shockoe.com. Again, Shockoe, SHOCKOE.com for more information on the company and more content from us. And then subscribe to Haptic Feedback on Apple Podcasts and Spotify for the last episode of this three-parter, but also previous conversations and notifications when we drop new ones. So again, if you missed the last episode, go check it out. But that last episode of this three-parter focused on breaking down product strategy as a methodology at a high level and how current trends in digital transformations, or like we discussed, digital first movements in various industries are guiding product development for mobile and web platforms and applications. So with part 2, we're going to be digging deeper into Shockoe's specific approach to product strategy, and we're going to be turning some of that into strategies for you, our audience, to apply to your own work, whether that is, if you're developing your own product or whether you're partnering with someone that's going to help develop a product for you, and are they bringing the right intention and the right strategy to the table? So we're rejoined by the product strategy team at Shockoe. We'll go down the list again. Mr. Chandler Tyler, welcome back. Yeah, good to have you back on. We're also rejoined by Mason Brown. Mason, how you doing?
I'm great. Ready to go.
Love it. The energy's high. And we're also joined by Toz Grewal. Toz, thank you again for joining us. How are you?
Living the dream. Excited to be here.
The dream. That's what I like to hear, man. That's what I like to hear. All right. So again, we've laid out in the last episode product strategy at a high level, how you see good strategies winning out, bad strategies, dampening visions for innovative change. So now we're going to take all of that and apply it to Shockoe's approach here. If you had to, look inward at Shockoe's product strategy style and strategy, what would you say makes it unique, right? Do you have any methodologies that you find are unique compared to other folks in the industry, or just something that you value, that you center, that really elevates your approach?
I think there's two pieces to that. From a approach standpoint, there is a constant fascination in the world of software around best practices, and I think that we do a good job of trying to stay abreast of the latest, greatest in terms of approaches to software development. I think our upside is that, and I say this a lot internally, is we get a lot of at-bats. We build a lot of software. We go through a lot of different projects with different clients from different industries. And by doing so, we tend to see a lot of similar patterns and problems that allow us to apply kind of a cumulative nature of our broader consulting work towards the helping the client. And that spans across not just the strategy group, but our design, engineering, QA. We're all kind of going through these problems and solving them together at a pretty rapid clip. So our advantage is really this kind of this cumulative nature. A lot of companies need to reduce call center volume, and there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that. But getting to the root of how to get to that is something that we have an experience, and we've gone through the motions, and I think we can make recommendations based on that. I don't know why I always go to call center volume. It's like my go-to, but it's a big one. Companies, it's a big thing. Or they want to improve, engagement loops, or they want to break their bounce rate. There's similar things, that different tactics obviously based on the client, but that experience helps.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, if what Mason's describing is kind of our sort of number of experiences or iterations of opportunities to do strategy, we also get to work very closely with the different people, both at Shockoe and with our clients, to really gain different perspectives on what product development means for different roles. And so, when we say we, at least pre-pandemic, sat next to a developer or a designer, that really is true. And so we have a good understanding of how they work, and they understand how we work. And I'd like to think that the solutions that we come up with together are that much better because there is that collaboration happening. And so if that's on the Shockoe side, on the client side, part of our job as strategists is often to make sure that the right people are in the room for a given meeting, whether that's presenting our key findings or, going through a product brief, whatever it is. We have the opportunity to get different takes from different roles. What does the CFO think? What does the head of marketing think? And I think those inputs have also made our work more well-rounded and robust.
I want to follow up on that. Could y'all get a little more granular on your approach to integrating and engaging the client from start to finish in the process? Because I'm sure there's a nice balance there of, you want to communicate often and make sure the client, can have those touch points so that you don't get too deep in product development and then hear back, oh, you went in such a wrong direction from what we were imagining. Start over, retrace your steps. It's like, why do all that rework? But also, I'm sure there has to be some level of like, hey, client, you have to trust us to have some level of, professional autonomy over how we create this so that like we can do our work right. And we want to include you in the process, but like we have to understand our roles in developing this, right? So tell me your approach there. How do you balance that? How do you build that trust and really granularly approach that integration and engagement of the client?
It's a really good question, and honestly, something that can be a challenge. And we're always working to be better at that. My first reaction is to explain that we have a really good kind of team structure at Shockoe, and everyone from the engagement manager who's kind of overseeing the overall engagement to the specific project manager on that project, and then the strategist, and there's a lead of technology and a lead of design on every project. So I think we've tried to set ourselves up for success in terms of having the right people be able to work with the client to make sure that they understand what we're doing. And again, that whole kind of get the right people in the room thing, having our team be well configured helps us do that. But it can be a challenge sometimes to kind of get everybody on the same page. And so one thing that we're doing more often now is really almost starting strategy like in the pre-sales phase of a project, and having one of us talk to a prospect early on so that they understand what our role is and why we think it should be valuable from their perspective. And I think that helps build rapport, in the early days of an engagement, and there's just a better understanding going into, a discovery part of a project where we're working, very closely with the client, and that they understand what they're going to get from that.
And I think to your point earlier too, Daniel, and kind of, I think the other part of what Chandler talking about is like just an establishment of trust early on, and a kind of a rhythm and cadence of how we talk and speak with clients. I think one of the big upsides of like us as an entire shop is just our software process is pretty transparent when you're working with us, and we mold to what a client needs or doesn't want. Some want more hands-on, some want more hands-off. But I think that a big part of strategy is that alignment piece, and constantly referring back to like, we can look at this problem, or we can discuss this, but let's make sure we're staying focused on solving your problems and your goals. And those are very candid, honest conversations. Like it's not a sales pitch. It's not it's like if we want to make this happen, we got to think about this.
Yeah. And I think on a base level too, people want to feel heard, right? And I think kind of setting that tone and expectation early on that the client feedback and the client response is a persistent aspect of what informs everything that we do, I think is kind of foundational to how we approach that problem.
And we're experts in product development and delivery. Like, we build software. We're never going to be experts in supply. I mean, we've done a lot of work in supply chain, a lot of work in grocery, a lot of work in various, startups and industries, but also every one of our clients comes with a immense amount of knowledge that all we want to do is multiply. And that's kind of our, MO.
I'm glad you brought up the team structure, because I feel like the emphasis on cross-functional teams creates a lot of that nimbleness and being able to respond quickly to new updates from the client, and to have communication to the client across every touch point that feels like it's informed with the previous step, right? And that there isn't this strange sense of you hand it off to the next team to move the product along, and all of a sudden you're starting from scratch, and it feels like the client is developing a new relationship with a new set of people. Now, with that in mind, that kind of brings up a difference between a product manager and a product strategist, and maybe any other professional roles there that hone in on a specific aspect of overseeing and executing and delivering on the product strategy. Can y'all break down how those differences map out in practice, or at least how Shockoe defines those differences, to be intentional and thoughtful in that process? So again, between product manager, product strategist, and really any other role you see fit in drawing some comparison to.
Yeah, I think it's a thing that we're running into more and more too, as companies scale their internal product organizations. You're seeing product manager as a role in an increasing amount of organizations that we work with. So a lot of times, the product manager is kind of our when the client has that role in their company, we work very closely with them. Obviously, they are the one who manage the product, or they are responsible for the product. They could be a primary stakeholder. I think the other thing that's interesting to call out too is that when you think of product management through the lens of like the three-legged stool of product management, design, and development, at our organization we kind of satisfy that in that three-pronged stool. So like how we interface with our teams internally is very similar to that rhythm, and that's probably where we're the closest. But also like interfacing with product managers at the client side is a big part of taking a product manager who has a large portfolio of products and then supporting one of their efforts or two of their efforts with one of our strategists. Is kind of how we fit in there.
We can offer a different perspective than an internal product manager can, and sometimes that's recognized and intentional. That if they're partnering with Shockoe to help design and develop a new product or maybe a new piece of their product, that we can offer kind of an unbiased third-party perspective that isn't necessarily mired in the corporate history or the history of the product, and we can come in and be more objective about what are we seeing, what are we hearing, and therefore what do we recommend. And so kind of going back to that well-rounded approach that we want to have, I think we can offer a new perspective for them.
And then to go ahead and wrap up this part 2 of our 3-part conversation, let's get y'all's perspective on some of Shockoe's strategy activities that you find particularly helpful in creating those touch points with the client, in creating that sort of cross-departmental communication internally. Just off the dome, I know that there is, a big focus on user testing. You have something called success workshops that you focus on as well in that process. Go ahead and break some of those down for us and connect the dots between that strategy, but the value that Shockoe sees in focusing on that as part of a larger product strategy.
Jumping into, I think, an advantage of us being traditionally outsiders going into companies is an advantage of our services in general is we are professional question askers, and many of our activities are driven on inquiry and synthesis. So we will shadow activities, and we're asking a million questions that to clients oftentimes seem either obvious or pretty routine or rote, but they help inform a lot of technology decisions, design decisions, and synthesizing that back to our teams and really understanding. Chandler recently was shadowing a crane. They build cranes. Crane inspection. You know what I mean? And there's both an advantage to that novice eye that, we're looking at. It's a novice eye with a bend towards technology. And the same thing goes when talking to customers and when talking to stakeholders, but just really asking great questions quickly and getting to the root of, why something matters or why it's stopping you or that problem identification phase.
To build on that, the shadowing, while not a new or novel concept by any means, but that when we get the opportunity to actually go on site with a client and observe someone going about their day who is going to be a potential user of the software that we're going to build, that is incredibly valuable for us to see. You would be amazed at how much you can learn by just watching somebody do their job, and everything from certain physical realities of, like with this crane inspection example, having being up in a scissor lift and not wanting to have a tablet in your hand for fear of dropping it. It's like, okay, how do we solve that, even if it doesn't end up being part of the software necessarily, but it's an important problem to call out for the stakeholders, and something to just consider in terms of how that gets rolled out to the employees, and change management training, things like that. So I really value the shadowing opportunities when we can do them.
What you mentioned there, Chandler, too, is something that reminds me of how I feel like I say this phrase at least like twice a week, but nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Strategy does not happen in a vacuum, design does not happen in a vacuum, and development does not happen in a vacuum. So similarly, those three efforts, I think, function in their best possible form when they're done in tandem with the client and in tandem with each other. You guys have all heard me talk about feedback. I like getting my strategic outputs critiqued by not just fellow product strategy folks, but from designers and from software developers as well. So I think kind of having this kind of big collaborative effort is a big part of that as well.
Totally. We're often asking everybody, does this make sense, right? And that's an important part of our job, is that whatever we produce and convey, we want it to make sense to pretty much anybody that consumes it, right? So definitely getting internal gut checks, and then even asking like friends and family to look at things or take surveys or whatever. We really want to have a lot of different kind of perspectives on the outputs that we deliver.
And I think on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up part 2 of this 3-parter. So our audience can, get a little tease for what's to come. In our last part of this 3-parter, we're going to be analyzing and building out some of those actionable tips, and more specifically, understanding how Shockoe measures its strategy work, so that Shockoe can guarantee that all of these strategies, the granular stuff, the efforts for communication, actually pan out and turn into new products, new mobile or web platforms and applications that are actually tangibly useful and can be measured to be useful for end users. So before we get into that part, we'll go ahead and wrap up this one. So thank you again to our guests. It's been a pleasure chatting with the 3 of you. Thanks again to Chandler Tyler, Mason Brown, and Toz Grewal. Folks, we'll be back around with part 3 soon. And thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of Haptic Feedback, a Shockoe podcast. If you like what you heard and saw today, and you don't want to miss out on part 3 of this 3-part conversation, you want to catch up on the previous episode or just any of our other conversations, make sure that you're heading to our website, shockoe.com. Again, Shockoe, SHOCKOE.com, as well as make sure you're subscribing to Haptic Feedback on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Haptic Feedback.